So, it's good to be here. I'm a writer, and I feel slightly out of place here. I don't know anything about robots, or engineering, technology, any of these things. I have a very old-fashioned talk I'm going to give you on an old-fashioned piece of paper. So, I am a writer. I'm from England. I live in Ireland. And over the last 30 years, I've published 9 books, 3 novels, 2 books of poetry. The rest of them are non-fiction books. Journalism, investigation. I've published goodness knows how many pieces of journalism. I've been an editor for magazines. I've worked in Fleet Street in London on the newspapers. This was back in the day when we actually had newspapers. Some of you are too young to remember newspapers. But in the old days they were printed on paper, and I used to work for them. So, I have been a writer in many different forms and a publisher in many different forms as well. I've also founded an international network of writers and artists called the Dark Mountain Project 15 years ago, which was designed very much like this festival actually, to persuade writers or to give voice to writers who are trying to engage with what we might call the crisis of meaning in the world today. So I have a long experience of writing and publishing and editing and everything else associated with it. So what I'm going to do today is I'm simply going to give you 12 pieces of writing advice. Pieces of advice I've gathered from my experience for creative writers, which may be useful to you. Whatever you're writing, whether it's novels, poetry, screenplays, anything like that. Now, it might not be the kind of advice that you would get from writing schools or anybody else, but it's the kind of advice that I have found useful myself. And what I particularly want to do for anyone who's a creative artist, for anyone who's a writer, is encourage you to find your story and follow it. So I'm going to give you 12 pieces of writing advice, and you can see how useful they are. And at the end of it, I'm happy to take any questions or hear your opinions. So let's start with a quote from an American writer, an American poet, Gary Snyder. He says, "The arts are the wilderness areas of the imagination, surviving like national parks in the midst of civilized minds." So there's something wild about the creative spirit. Whatever it is you're writing, there's something about it that needs not to be tamed, that you need to be able to take out there into the world. So, I'm going to give you, as I say, 12 pieces of writing advice. Number 1, find your story and follow it. Now, the novelist James Woods wrote a very good book called How Fiction Works. If you're interested in writing fiction, whether it's novels or screenplays or anything else, it's a very useful book, quite a short book. And James Woods suggests there are 2 types of writers. The first type of writer can write about almost anything. They can find a subject that interests them, they can write about that, then they can go on to another completely different subject. Maybe they write a book about ghosts, and then they write a book about technology, and then they write a book about something else completely. They're just interested in things, and they can write about any number of different things. The second type of writer is somebody who just has one story that they're following or are obsessed with, and they keep telling that story in lots of different forms. A good example he gives is the English novelist D.H. Lawrence, who was writing all about sexuality and the body and the nature, the relationship between humans and nature, and whatever he wrote, he was always telling the same story. Now, I'm one of those writers as well. I'm always telling the same story. Even when I try not to tell the story, I end up telling the same story. It's always about the relationship between humanity and nature and what the meaning of culture is. I keep coming back to that story. It's the story I tell everywhere, even when I don't want to. And as I say, I've written 3 novels. The first novel was set 1,000 years ago in England. The second novel is set today. And the third novel is set 1,000 years in the future. They're very different books, but they all have a linking theme to them. It's the relationship between people and place, the relationship between people and nature, and what that means, how it forms a human life. My story is really that I think the modern world has broken that relationship, and I'm always digging into that. Sometimes I get bored with the story and fed up with listening to myself, so I try to write something else, but I keep coming back to the story anyway. So the first thing to think about when you're a writer is, what kind of writer are you? Do you have a story that you're following, that you need to tell? Or are you the kind of writer that can tell any story at all? Are you just interested in different kinds? If you have a story to tell, You need to understand what the story is. What is the thing that obsesses you? Why do you want to write at all? Writing is a difficult thing to do. You're not going to make very much money from it. You probably won't get very well known. You might do, but you might not. You don't do it for those reasons. So the question is, what story do you want to tell? And once you know that, then you can make sure you don't get distracted from telling that story. And whatever means you have to tell it, you will tell it. And only you, probably, can tell your story. Because everybody is quite a distinctive person. You will have an understanding of the world that nobody else quite has. So your writing can be used to bring that out. And the job of a writer is to get really good at what they do, so that you can be good enough to tell your story. Here's a quote from Annie Dillard. Annie Dillard is a beautiful American writer. If you haven't come across her, I recommend her writing. This is a book called The Writing Life. It's not really advice, it's a series of observations on what it actually means to be a writer, what it's like to live as a writer. It's a very good book. Let me just read this paragraph, because it's all about this. It's all about your distinctive story. She says this: "Why do you never find anything written about that particular thought you advert to, about your fascination with something that no one else understands? Because it's up to you. There is something you find interesting for a reason that is hard to explain. It's hard to explain because you've never read it on any page. There you begin. You were made and set here to give voice to this, your own astonishment. In other words, if you can't find anyone telling the story you want to tell, it's because you need to tell it. That's your job. So you find your story, your distinctive understanding of the world, and then you work out how to tell it. So that's the first piece of advice. Piece of advice number 2, ignore your audience. Now this is the opposite of the advice you will normally be given. Right? You will normally be told to listen to your audience and give them what they want and take their feedback. That's not writing, that's marketing. Okay, and you're not marketing, you're writing. They're very, very different things. The minute you start giving people what they want, you've walked away from the story you want to tell, and you're telling people what they want to hear. And the funny thing is that as soon as you start telling people what they want to hear, they don't really want to hear it. Because what actually people want is creative, interesting writing that tells them something they might not have known or thought about. So you're not in the business of marketing, and the danger of the internet is the same thing as the opportunity of the internet. If you're writing online, which I do, you can have your readers commenting on your articles, and you can see if they've subscribed to them or unsubscribed to them. You can see why they like them. You can look at a little algorithmic picture of how many subscribers you've got, and it can be very, very tempting to say, oh, this article was popular. I'll keep writing things like that. This one wasn't popular, so I won't say that anymore. But the minute you start thinking like that, you won't follow the story you need to tell. You'll be telling people what you think they want to hear. You'll just be giving them stuff for money, effectively. And that's going to destroy your creative soul. And it's going to make your writing very boring as well. Most of the writing in the world today is giving people what they think they want. But people don't know what they want. If you'd asked people before Harry Potter was written what kind of children's book they'd like to see, maybe they'd have based it on books they'd already read. But J.K. Rowling went into a cafe on her own when she had no money and created a whole series of books about what was going on in her mind. And she wasn't paid any money for it, no one had ever heard of her, and they became hugely successful because she didn't give people what they want, she gave people what she wanted. She gave people her story, and it worked. So, success can be quite dangerous. If you get successful as a writer and you're known for doing certain things, then you're tempted to keep giving people things. So you need to know when to stop doing that. You need to know when to walk away from it. I ran my organization, the Dark Mountain Project, for 7 years. And after that time, I realized I was just saying the same thing. And I didn't have any reason to keep saying it. I was just repeating myself. And I probably could have gone on repeating myself for another 5 or 10 years, but I couldn't do it. I wanted to do something else. So always follow your story and ignore what your audience wants. Give them what you need to say. And you will find that the more you do that, the more people will read you. Because what people really want is independent, creative thinkers. Whether you're creating a film. I mean, how many films do we see that look like all the other films? How many films is Hollywood producing that are just manufactured by marketing people who say, well, this film worked, so we'll do this. And here are the elements we need to put in a film. And it's boring. The irony is that the more you tailor your work to your audience, the more bored your audience gets. What they really want is something creative and different that makes them excited. Star Wars would be a great example. Look at the first Star Wars film. George Lucas made that for hardly any money. It was very strange. It wasn't like anything else that was out there, but he had this vision, so he did it. Look at Star Wars now. Disney's running it, and they're spending billions on it, and they're algorithmically marketing and checking it, and it's boring and awful because it's not creative. So tell the story you need to tell and ignore what you think the audience wants. And funnily enough, you might find the audience likes it. Quote from the English novelist John Fowles. He says this: "At heart, write always for yourself, not for family and friends, for admired teachers, for reviewers or publishers, but make sure you write from your real self, not that one besotted by dreams of a future self. One day you will realize that the true rewards of writing lie in the writing itself." Simple as that. The only reason to write is to write, because you really love it. And if you do that, your passion will come across. Okay, piece of advice number 3, be ambitious. Be ambitious in telling your story, and don't go to writing school. Most important thing. Never go to a writing school. Writing schools are awful. They teach you how to write like all the other people going to the writing school. There's been a huge explosion in the West, in Britain, in the last 20 years of university courses in creative writing, and people go on these things and they think that if they go on the course it'll teach them how to be a novelist. Mostly it doesn't. But what it actually teaches people is how to subtly write in the same way as all the other people who've been to the writing school. And so all the novels that come out are boring. I was speaking to an American writer a couple of weeks ago in the States. Her name is Mary Osborne, and she's the best-selling children's writer in America, and most people have never heard of her. She sold, I think it's 137 million books. And she's never been to a writing school or a university. She spent her life, when she was young, hitchhiking around and working in cafes. And she came up with this idea about 2 children and a magic tree house. And she started writing this book on her own, published it on her own. Eventually it got picked up by a big publisher, and it worked through word of mouth because she had a great idea for a story, and she had a lot of life experience, and she just did it on her own with no training. And it worked because it was distinctive. And she said, whatever you do, don't go to writing school. She said, if your children are interested in writing, make them go and drive trucks or work in cafes. Go and do something in the real world, because that's how you get your experience. It's good advice. Be ambitious, and don't let anyone else homogenize your story. Here's a quote from Vladimir Nabokov. He said, "We judge writers either as teachers, storytellers, or enchanters. And it is the enchanter who outlasts time." So the really great thing to be is an enchanter. And you can only do that if you have a story and you've worked out how to tell it. William Wordsworth, the English poet, he said, "Every great and original writer must himself create the taste by which he is to be relished." That's another way of saying you've got the story and you have to work out how to tell it. Okay, piece of advice number 4. Accept advice from other people. Now, I've been saying a lot about how you follow your own story and ignore your readers and all that, but you also have to learn how to listen to people who have something useful to say to you. When you are a writer, you have to work with editors. I've done a lot of working with editors in lots of different types of publishing house, and there are good editors and bad editors. A good editor is somebody who can see what your story is and what you want to do and helps you to do it. Brings out the best in you. Says to you, this doesn't work and this doesn't work and here's what you need to do instead, because they know what you're trying to do. A bad editor is somebody who tries to turn your story into something else, or turn your book into the kind of book that they would like to write. So accept advice and learn to distinguish between good advice and bad advice. Always keep an eye on your story. Remember what you're doing. And as I say, listen to people who can help you to do it better, especially when you're starting off, because you don't know what you're doing. You have to learn what to do. I've been writing for 30 years. I'm still learning what to do. You never stop learning. You never stop improving your story. If you do stop, you get boring. And also you get bored. You have to keep changing. But listen to people who can say, I really like what you're doing, but here's what doesn't work. Here's what doesn't work. Do this instead. Try that. Learn to distinguish between good advice and bad advice. Take the good advice, ignore the bad advice. That's something that comes with experience. Okay, piece of advice number 5. Love sentences. This is really important. Love sentences. Learn words. Be in love with words. Be interested in what sentences can do. Everything is created at the smallest level. The sentence is the basis for anything you are creating. You won't create a good novel or a good screenplay or anything else unless the sentences are good, and you won't create good sentences unless you're strangely obsessed with writing. So you have to read a lot of other books, read great novels and think, I love this. Why do I love this? What does this writer do? How can I do this? Or if you see a bad novel, why isn't this working? What's wrong with this book? Why is it boring? Why is this bad writing and this is good writing? What's the difference? Ask yourself that. Be curious. Read dictionaries and learn new words. When I was a child, I used to read dictionaries just because I wanted to know new words. Slightly nerdy thing to do. I wrote a book about 5 years ago called Savage Gods, which is a book about writing. And it's actually a book about my struggle with writing. My struggle with whether writing was something which could open up the world, or whether it was something which closed down the world, or whether it's both of those things at once. Whether too many words actually cuts you off from reality, or whether the words can open you up to reality, and what the difference is. And I had a paragraph in there about writing. I'll read it to you. Writers fall short at everything except creating sentences. This is what we really like to do. Put words in an order which can conjure something real but unseen in the air around us and around you when you read what we have put down. Really, this business of sentences is the only thing we can do and the only thing that motivates us. All the rest, the stories, the characters, the metaphors, the morals, and the messages, they come later with varying degrees of success. Everything is built on the sentences. We just love sentences and we can't get proper jobs. So that's writing. That's who we are. Here is Ursula Le Guin. If you haven't read any of Ursula Le Guin's books, you should. She's a brilliant American writer. She says this: a writer is a person who cares about what words mean and what they say and how they say it. Writers know words are their way towards truth and freedom, and so they use them with care, with thought, with fear, with delight. By using words well, they strengthen their souls. Storytellers and poets spend their lives learning that skill and art of using words well. Their words make the souls of their readers stronger, brighter, and deeper. So if you can really learn to use words and create beautiful sentences, you can change something in the way that your readers experience the world. If you think about any great book you've read or any great film you've seen, it changes your understanding of the world in some way. You might not even be able to explain it. It's all about the words you use. Which is connected to point 6, avoid cliches. Very important. You're being deliberate in the words you use. Don't use lazy words. Particularly in the age of the internet where everybody's using the same memes and the same language and yada, yada, yada. Everyone, it's easier than ever to communicate without thinking. Just to use words everybody else uses because we don't even think about what they are. That might be fine in a text message or on social media or something. But it isn't fine when you're trying to create something artistic, something real, something that tells people about the world. You have to avoid cliches, which means look at the language and think, is that a cliche? Is that something anybody else says? Everybody else says? Can I think of a better way to describe that? What do I really see when I look at something? Don't just borrow words from everybody else or from the hive mind. Do it yourself. The English writer Martin Amis says this: all writing is a campaign against cliché. Not just clichés of the pen, but clichés of the mind and clichés of the heart. When I dispraise, I am usually quoting clichés. When I praise, I am usually quoting the qualities of freshness, energy, and reverberation of voice. All writing starts with seeing. You can't really write about something until you've really seen it. And if you can see it freshly, you can write about it freshly. Look at something that you've seen a million times before. Look at a chair, look at a microphone, look at a big screen, look at a flag, whatever it is. And think about, how could I describe that in a way that no one else has ever described it? How could I say something which makes people look at that freshly? And again, if you think about great books you've read, that's what they do. Great poems, great novels. They make you look at something in a way you've never looked at it before, and then they use language which is different from the way we normally use language. And they make you say, oh, that thing that I see every day that I ignore actually is quite special. There's something about it that can make me see the world differently. You can't write beautifully unless you can see differently. Everything begins with seeing. Different types of seeing lead to different types of writing. Here's a great quote from the artist Paul Cézanne, which I love. He says, "The day is coming when a single carrot, freshly observed, will set off a revolution." I really like that. Painters really understand this. How can I paint this thing in a way that makes people see it differently? All the modernist art movements are about trying to do this. How can we change people's perspectives so that they see this, whether it's Impressionism or Cubism or anything else? How can we shock people into seeing differently the things that they see all the time? How can we make them see a carrot in a way that starts a revolution? I like that idea. Rilke, great German poet Rilke. "Everything beckons us to perceive it," he says. "Whispers at every turn, remember me." Everything wants to be seen. Everyone wants to be seen. How can you see them freshly? Okay, number 7. Keep going. This is important for all writers, especially if they want to have any kind of writing career. You're going to get rejected. You're going to get ignored. You're going to write many things that are terrible all the way through your life. As I say, I've been doing this for 30 years. Most of the stuff I write is still terrible. The kind of thing that you see published is only the tip of the iceberg of the writer's career. All the stuff under the water that you never see is all the rejected manuscripts. I've got 2 novels at home that no one ever published, which is good because they're awful, and lots of poems and millions of other things too. You have to keep going. It's easier than ever to publish your own stuff. It's also easier than ever to publish rubbish, and it's maybe harder than ever to be published in any kind of conventional way. I was desperate to be a famous writer when I was a young man. I'm not anymore, but I was then. And as I say, I was writing novels which were terrible and poems which were terrible and getting rejected all the time, receiving lots of letters. In those days it was all about letters. And you just have to go through it. And you have to learn from it. Why did this book get rejected? Why is this poem no good? Why do people keep saying no to me? Why can't I get published here and there? Don't get bitter about it, learn from it. You have to go through that. It's like anything else. If you were learning to be an electrician or a chair maker or a farmer, make a lot of mistakes before you get good. If you're a furniture maker, how many bad chairs do you have to make before you make a chair you can sit on? It's the same as anything else. Same with a book. You're not going to pick up a pen and suddenly be Tolstoy. So you have to keep going. And you have to write all the time. People who write are usually obsessed with writing all the time, writing every day, even if it's only a few sentences. Just keep going, keep practicing your craft. Again, it's like anything else. If you don't keep practicing your craft, you'll be no good. If you want to be a great guitar player, you've got to play the guitar every day. You can't just pick it up every month. You've got to play it every day and practice even when you don't want to because it's boring. And it's the same with writing. You need to try and write every day. You need to keep going. You need to produce lots of bad stuff. And then suddenly in the midst of about 10 pages of terrible writing, you'll have one great sentence. And you'll think, oh look, I did something there. And you can do something with that and use it. So you've got to be a bit obsessed, actually. Again, like anything else, you've got to be obsessed with the thing you're doing to want to keep doing it. And keep going, even when nobody understands it or you get rejected. Keep doing it, because if you do, it'll get good. And when it gets good, people will start paying attention to it. And the only thing people pay attention to is original, interesting, beautiful writing. That's what they want. As I said earlier, they don't want to be told what they already know. They want something special. So you've got to get good at making something special. Okay, number 8. This is important. Learn how stories work. I said earlier that it's a good idea to read novels or watch films and think, why is that good and why is that bad? Why does this work and why does that not work? What is a story? How does a story actually function? Tolstoy said there are only 2 stories in the world. Tolstoy was always saying things like that. There are only 2 stories in the world, he said. Number 1, someone leaves on a journey. And number 2, a stranger arrives in town. Quite like that. It's worth thinking about that, thinking whether he was right or wrong. Somebody once said to me, those could be the same story. Right? Someone leaves on a journey, a stranger arrives in town. This could be the beginning and the end of the same story. That's what Tolstoy said. There's only 2 stories in the world. There's an English writer called Christopher Booker. He thinks there are 7 stories in the world. And he wrote a book a few years ago called The 7 Basic Plots. He just read vast amounts of literature from all over the world and decided that he could put everything into 7 categories. And it's worth reading things like this just to think about, is this guy right or is he completely wrong? What's wrong with what he says? But reading about stories and how they work, how they actually function, is how you'll learn to tell them. Because there are some pretty common story structures around the world. And it doesn't mean you have to copy them and you can't break them, but if you understand what they are, It can really help you to understand how to tell a story. I think this is particularly important in film, actually, because film has quite a limited, it's an hour and a half or 2 hours maybe for a film, and you've got to get the structure right. It's very easy to get bored. Same with a novel as well. You can bore your readers if you don't have some sort of narrative path. I'll tell you what Christopher Booker's stories are, actually, in case they're useful. This can be quite interesting. See what you think of the 7 basic plots. So he says plot number 1 is overcoming the monster. Stories like Beowulf, Dracula, Star Wars. You go out there to defeat something in the world, defeat some antagonistic monster. Story number 2 is rags to riches. That's when somebody starts off poor, becomes rich, perhaps becomes poor again, but learns something on the journey. Lots of fairy tales are like that. Story number 3 he calls the quest. That's where somebody goes out to acquire something or defeat something. The Lord of the Rings would be a great example of that, but so would a classic like the Iliad. There's always a quest that the hero has to go out and achieve. And then number 4, voyage and return. That's related to the quest. Somebody goes out to a strange land, comes back home again, learns something on the way. The Odyssey would be a good example. So with the Ramayana from India. And then number 5, he has comedy. Shakespeare's comedies are full of this light-hearted, humorous take on the world. Then number 6, you have tragedy. Usually in a tragedy, there's a hero with a tragic flaw. And that tragic flaw will undo them. Stories like Macbeth or Anna Karenina would be examples of that. You may be sympathetic to the hero or the heroine, but something will destroy them, and the tragedy, you can almost see it coming from the beginning. And then finally, he suggests the last story is rebirth. And rebirth is when some event happens to a character and forces them to change their whole worldview. They become something new. Lots of fairy tales are like that, actually. Beauty and the Beast, the Snow Queen, the Frog Prince. There's lots of fairy tale stories which are either about journeys and returns or about this rebirth. Something changes. And often in a fairy tale, it physically changes. The frog becomes a prince, or some magical transformation happens, which is symbolic of something that's going on inside you. The character changes through an experience that they have. So that's Christopher Booker's idea of the 7 basic plots. Whether or not you agree with them, it's worth thinking about what a story is and how it works. Think about the structure of a story. Do I want to write a story that fits into those structures? Do I want to break the structures a bit? The story's got to have an arc. It's got to have something going for it. So the more you learn about how story works, the more you think about that, the better your story's likely to be. Okay, advice number 9, keep off the internet. This might not be popular in a technological polytechnic, I'm sorry, but turn it off, at least while you write, okay? Because it's the biggest distraction machine in history. Now, writers tend to procrastinate. I do this all the time. We want excuses not to write. We do everything except writing. Everything except sitting down and actually doing the thing. So the internet will, of course, allow you to spend all day on social media or YouTube or anything else, distracting yourself. So it's a good idea to have somewhere you can write with no internet connection. I have a little cabin out the back of my house where I write, and there's no internet there, so I have no excuse. Sometimes the internet's useful for writing. For research, and you need to do that. That's fine, of course, but having it on while you write will do 2 things. Firstly, it will just distract you all the time from the business of writing. And secondly, it will just fracture your mind and make it distracted and frazzled. And you'll be thinking in lots of bits and pieces and looking at 20 websites at once. You won't have the focus that you need to keep the story going. So I really strongly recommend turning off your internet connection while you're actually writing. Number 10, find the image. This is related somewhat to what I was saying earlier about the importance of seeing differently. There's an image very often at the heart of great stories. And if you think about some of the films you might have seen or some of the books you might have read, often you come away with the image of the thing, even when you've forgotten what the story is. So again, if you think about fairy tales, you have dwarves and dragons and woods and witches and red apples and white skin, and all these are images that stay with you longer than the story. You might forget the story of Snow White and the 7 dwarves, but you remember those aspects of it. You remember the colours, you remember the apple, you remember the image. Often there's an image at the heart of the story, something that stays with you. Image is older than story. And story is older than argument. So images can help people understand something they don't even quite understand with their rational mind. You can leave people with things that will stay with them, even as they don't quite understand the story. I mean, if you think about a film by someone like Tarkovsky, for example, sometimes you don't really understand what the film is saying. You have to watch it 10 times. But there's an image in there There are different images in there that he's created very particularly. The image will stay with you. And you'll think, what's that? And it stays in your mind and it will do something to you, even as you may not understand exactly what the point is that he's trying to say, even if there is a point. So images can often be absolutely core. Here's a story. I wrote two novels, as I say, one set 1,000 years ago, one set today. And I had an email from a reader, and he said, I love your novels, which is always a good start when you get an email. He said, I love your novels because they're the only books I've read which understand the importance of bird song. And I thought, what's he talking about? I've never written about bird song. And then he said, all of the important things that happen in your novels are always introduced with the appearance of a bird or with the song of a bird. And I thought, really? So I went back and I looked at my novels, and he was right. Almost every important plot point, there's a bird. And I had not done that on purpose. And I was so interested in this that when I wrote my third novel, I deliberately put birds at the center of it as a specific example of that reader. But you see, I'd put the image of birds and birdsong all the way through my books without knowing it. And he'd noticed it, and I hadn't. It's very interesting. Probably an academic would read those books and think that I'd cleverly done it on purpose, which would be nice, but I didn't. So the image can really stay with people. And that was an example of that. John Ashbery, the American poet, he said, it's rather hard to be a good artist and also to be able to explain intelligently what your art is about, which I think is worth thinking about too. Argument and creative writing are different. So find the image, even if you're doing it subconsciously. Two more pieces of advice. Number 11, publish appropriately. There are loads of different ways to publish now. When I was younger, you wanted to publish a book, you had to go find an agent and go to a publisher. You can still do that. If you wanted to get into a newspaper or a magazine, you had to write to them, send them examples of things, and you can still do that. But of course now you can publish anything anywhere. I have a Substack page. I have 60,000 readers on my Substack page. I publish essays and stories on there. And I go directly to my readers, and they pay me directly, and I communicate directly with them. I don't need an editor. That's great. It's got pros and cons. It means you can go directly to people, but of course it also means you haven't got an editor helping you to publish well. But there are loads of different ways you can publish things. You can set up your own publishing company. You can publish your own pamphlets. You can put things on the internet. You can still go down the mainstream publishing route. This will be true of films as well. Many different ways to make a film. But particularly if you're just a creative writer, there are many different ways you can do it. And sometimes some books will suit one particular thing. I've published with some of the biggest publishers in the world, like Faber and Penguin. I've published with small startup publishers. My first novel was longlisted for the Booker Prize in England, and that was published by a startup crowdfunding publisher. I've published with small poetry publishers. I've set up my own press. There are different ways to publish different things. You don't have to do everything all the same way. So if you think as creatively about the publishing as you do about the writing, you'll find that there are different ways to get your work out into the world, and they may be appropriate for different kind of books. So be as creative in publishing as you are in writing, would be my advice. And finally, piece of advice number 12. If you want to be a writer, you already are. Okay, this is important. All you need to be a writer is a pen and a piece of paper. It's the most democratic job in the world. Don't need to be trained. Don't need any qualifications or connections. You literally just need your piece of paper and your pen or your typewriter or your laptop or however you write. And then you do it. And you just keep doing it. And you get better at doing it. You don't need anything else. You can do other things. You can go on the courses and do all of this stuff. But you start there. And that's why some of the greatest writers come from poor backgrounds or uneducated backgrounds, have experience in the world, don't have the so-called training that you need, because in the end, you will be recognized if you're good. Okay? You're not going to necessarily be rich and famous, but if you get good at what you do and you can see originally and think differently and do all the things I've been suggesting here, you will be noticed because you'll be doing something distinctive. And anyone can do that. So if you want to be a writer, there's no qualification. I mean, I'm standing here talking to you because I'm a writer, but I'm just a guy with a pen and paper like you, and I happen to have had some things published, so here I am. But I'm still making it up as I go along. I don't have a PhD in it. I just did it, and anyone can do the same. So if you're writing, you're already a writer. Here's Josh Olson, the American writer. He said, "You cannot discourage a writer. If someone can talk you out of being a writer, you're not a writer. Same with anything else. You want to be a great guitarist, as I said earlier. You're just obsessed with the guitar, you get good. Same with writing. And all you need is your pen and paper, and they cost you nothing. Anyone can afford them. So it's exciting in that way. You can just start from nowhere. You don't need anyone's permission. And there's no way of measuring it. And there's no way of concluding that you're suddenly a real grown-up writer and you weren't before. Because everything's up and down. So all you do, to go back to what John Fowles said, you write because you love writing. It's the only reason to do it. Get really good at it and then see what happens. I'm just going to end on a quote from a poem by W.S. Merwin, the American poet. It's one of my favorite poems. He wrote a poem called Berryman, and it's about John Berryman, the American poet, who was Merwin's tutor. So when Merwin was a student your age, he was at university in America, and he had John Berryman, a very famous poet, as his tutor. And he wrote a whole poem about that experience. And the end of the poem really stayed with me, because he asks Berryman for some advice about writing, about how to be a poet. Merwin ended up as the poet laureate of America. But back then, he's just a student. And he says to him this: "I had hardly begun to read. I asked, 'How can you be sure that what you write is really any good at all?' And he said, 'You can't. You can't. You can never be sure if anything you write is any good at all. If you have to be sure, don't write.'" I'll leave you with that. Thank you.